Okay, so this is still going. What they did know well was their local world. They understood the threat of local whites, but they had also learned to use them. They had integrated white material culture into their own, witnessed the silver place settings and brass kettles cached at the Clearwater campground, and they had learned the ropes of economic exchange well enough to amass considerable cash, which they now used to buy flour and other supplies from merchants at Stevensville. They understood local power, at least as far as it had been revealed. It rested mostly with ranchers, farmers, and businessmen, and with John Monteith, who was enough of a force that the majority of Nez persons had come into his orbit for protection. As for that distant power of the never-seen Great Father and his government, it had to have been a mystery, promising this now and later, threatening and then reversing, all the while never showing much of a real presence. No kidding. I can see that. Then when things turned nasty, there had been the army. Soldiers with rifles were indeed a worry, but the Nez Perces had no knowledge of military force beyond their own country and could not possibly have grasped how troops were being funneled in from as far away as Georgia. The only soldiers they had seen so far were ones they had known already. To say the least, they had handled them well. This was the context of their decision to leave home. By one account, some leaders wanted to stand their ground. The question, one said, was whether in their home country, the land where their fathers were buried, the white man or the Injun has got to die. That was in quotes. Stay, he urged, and, quote, drive the white man away from our land. Others answered that too many whites were there, with more coming all the time. In neither prospect, however, was anything beyond the immediate vicinity even considered. In the end, the decision was that the combination against them, the army and civilians and the reservation bands, would allow them no refuge. The only real choice seemed to be to go east to, quote, the land where the buffalo stay. They saw that place as another separate small radius world. The whites there were friends. Once they knew that, quote, we will do them no wrong, they will be only glad to let us pass quickly and go on our way, unquote. There were soldiers east of the mountains, but, excuse me, there, quote, are not many, unquote. It was thought, and so not worth much worry. Too many bubbles. That's what I think. Okay. Next came the confrontation with Ron. He tried to explain. Quote, the soldiers of the west side and those of the east side were brothers, unquote. He said, quote, all under one great chief, and when Indians fought with one, they had to fight with the other, unquote. But that did not seem to register. The headmen stated their grievances with the Idahoans and their hatred of Howard. They, quote, would fight the one-armed chief wherever they met him. But over and over they stressed that they wanted only peace and friendship with the soldiers and their longtime white friends east of the Bitterroots. In one version of the council, following the talk with Ron, Looking-Glass said that crossing the Bitterroots had freed them from any future pursuit. If the officer Ron wishes to build corrals for the Nez Perces, a sarcastic reference. The officer Ron wishes to build corrals for the Nez Perces, a sarcastic reference to the log fort. He may, but they will not hold us back. We are not horses. The country is large. I think we are as smart as he is and know the roads and mountains well. Ron, that is, and only Ron, was the problem they faced, and they could handle that little bunch of soldiers from Missoula. The Vans could take their time. We had best take the world as easily as possible. Okay, what's going on? Sorry, I'm trying to figure this out. Okay. We had best take the world as easily as possible, he said. We are not fighting with the people of this country. Local Montanans seemed to agree. Once convinced the Indians were peaceful, they left Ron on his own. Being welcomed up into the shops at Stevensville would have stilled the Nez Perce's impression that they had passed from hostile to friendly country. No kidding. Tension evaporated. Ron's fort became a fizzle. From the Nez Perce perspective, finding safety and peace simply by crossing Lolo Pass was perfectly sensible. In fact, of course, that thinking was calamitously flawed. Crossing the Lolo Divide, they passed as well the boundary of their understanding into a new reality they could no more have comprehended than they could have imagined subways. In time, they would have to learn of it and how to manipulate it if they were ever to return home. A crucial gap in the Nez Perce knowledge was technological. They were largely oblivious to the revolution in transportation and communication that was helping create the new nation. No one among the resisting bands had ever seen a locomotive or a railroad. One account has Ron telling the headman that Howard soon, quote, will talk on the clack-clack with the great white chief far away. But nothing suggests that any of the resistors had ever seen a telegram. They had no notion of how a new infrastructure was binding the Union together, consolidating its power, and shrinking its distances to replace scores of small radius worlds with the one of the century ahead. They would soon begin to find out. Back on July 21st, General Philip Sheridan, head of the Division of the Missouri, had wired Colonel John Gibbon, commanding Fort Shaw on Montana's Sun River, to be ready to defend Montanans should the Nez Perces head their way. Gibbon telegraphed orders to Forts Ellis and Benton for units to join him, and on July 28th, spurred on by news from Lolo and a wire from Howard, Gibbon set off for Missoula with several companies of the 7th Infantry. He arrived there on August 3rd, and the next day started south in pursuit of the bands with 17 officers and 149 enlisted men. With rapid marches helped along by mule-drawn wagons, they gained ground steadily. By August 6th, Gibbon's men had gone the length of the Bitterroot Valley and were climbing into the mountains, at most 2 days behind the bands. Continuing on page 177, the telegraph, nothing illustrates better the unifying power of the new order than how information traveled during the war, in this case putting Gibbon close behind the bands. Howard, back in Idaho, had asked for help in a message sent from Lewiston through San Francisco to General Alfred Terry, head of the Department of the Dakotas, headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, who had passed it on to Gibbon in Montana. Governor Potts had asked for and been denied permission to recruit citizen volunteers through messages that had crackled over the wires among himself, Sheridan, and the Secretary of War in Washington. General William Sherman oversaw it all from wherever he happened to be. The effects of the talking wire were not limited to the upper ranks. Troopers like Theodore Golden in eastern Montana tracked events from the first raids and battles in Idaho to the opera buff at Fort Fizzle. They would follow the war more closely as it moved their way. The public, too, plugged into the informational flow. Facts and rumors flew over the wires, agitated settlers nearby, piquing the interest of readers across the continent and complicating military politics. News from the Northwest spawned Eastern editorials that nearly unseated Howard, who took the lesson and made sure his version of the Clearwater fight was the first one telegraphed to Sherman and the public. Even as the story unfolded, electronic transmissions gave the primary players faces and personalities, created heroes, goats, and martyrs, and made a kind of instant history that crystallized not over months and years, but in days and weeks. Telegraphy, that is, by essentially collapsing time and space, sped up the mythical integration of the West into the new nation. The point had been made dramatically the summer before. George Custer met his end on June 25, 1876. 2 days later, John Gibbon's command discovered the carnage. It took another 3 days for his column and their travois of wounded to reach the steamboat far west on the Missouri River, and it was nearly 6 more days later, close to midnight on June 5th, 10 days after the last stand, that the far west reached Bismarck. Bismarck had a telegraphic connection. Its operator, J.M. Carnahan, spent the next 22 hours sending out details, but the essence was set loose across the nation within moments and across the world within a few hours, virtually simultaneously with the Republic's centennial. Information might still move slowly by the old ways, by foot and horse and rivercraft, but once it tapped into the new system, it really got down to business.